Good morning. This session is on how can we come together as development partners, market players, research agencies to promote profitable, sustainable farmer-led irrigation solutions. My name is Muntaha Hassan. I work for the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. And I'm here today with Jenny Baron, who's Professor of Water Management in Agricultural Landscapes, Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. Rob Bertram, who is the Chief Scientist, Bureau for Food Security at USAID. Ariana Constant, who is the Director of Programs, Clinton Development Initiative at the Clinton Foundation. Selamawit Amare, who's a World Bank Fellow. Regasa Namara, who's a Senior Water Economist at the World Bank Group Water Global Practice, and Petra Schmetter, Research Group Leader, Agriculture Water Management at the International Water Management Institute. As all of you know, you're all experts. Most farmers are smallholder farmers, and a lot of them have less than 2 hectares to farm on. Usually relying completely on rain-fed agriculture, which is because of climatic changes is unreliable, and therefore economies, incomes, productivity are all negatively impacted. And right now I'm going to ask Selamawit to give us an introduction, her perspective about her experience in Ethiopia. And at the end of this session, I will ask all presenters a few questions, but then we will open it up for you to also ask them questions. Rob will help at the end of the session in giving us things to think about to increase our cooperation and put an action plan about how can we all work together, different roles in the market. How can we all work together to promote farmer-led irrigation? Selamawit, please go ahead.
Thank you, Muntaha. So I'm going to share my perspective on small-scale irrigation in the Ethiopian highlands and overall in Ethiopia. So small-scale rain-fed agriculture is the backbone of the Ethiopian economy that accounts 80% of the employment, as well as more than 90% of the export earning. So the average size of farm size for each land holding is 0.7 hectare. However, heavy reliance on low, erratic, and unevenly distributed rainfall throughout the country has affected the production and productivity throughout the country, and the farmers were unable to produce sufficient food to feed its population. So to deal with this problem, the government of Ethiopia set small-scale irrigation as a priority to deal with the problem of poverty, climate shocks, and to ensure sustainable growth. Therefore, even after the introduction of this policy, we only were able to use 5% of our irrigation potential for farming activities, and even with this 5% potentials, we have a lot of issues to deal with, such as efficiency, and we also have a lot of challenges. Also, we need to exploit the remaining 95% of our potentials. So I would like to tell some of the challenges as a country that we have in Ethiopia. The first one is the agroecological challenge. The second one is the socio-economic challenge. The third one is the institutional and technological challenge that we are facing as a country. I would like to emphasize more on the agroecological factors. The first one is water availability. So the availability of water throughout the country is very unevenly distributed. When we see the western part of Ethiopia, we have like 70% of the surface water, but at the same time, we only have 30% of the population in the western part of Ethiopia. Whereas when we see the eastern part of Ethiopia, we have 70% of the population, but we only have 30% of the water resources, surface water resources. So we have to deal with this temporal and spatial distribution of water. And the other problem that we are facing while introducing small-scale irrigation is land degradation. So when we talk about land degradation, we have on-site problems and off-site problems. The on-site impacts are land degradation affects the topsoil, the top productive soil, and it leads us to produce little amount of grains from the land. The other one is it reduces the size of agricultural land, including crops and crop and range lands. Also, the most important impact of land degradation is the off-site impacts. So we have farmers developing their own ponds in order to irrigate their own farmlands. However, the upland land degradation causes a lot of siltation to their water storage dams, and that also reduces the amount of water that can be used for irrigation activities throughout the year. We also have opportunities as a country to develop small-scale irrigation. The first one is we have abundant water resources, more than 100 billion cubic meter of surface water, and more than 13 billion cubic meter of groundwater resources. We also have cheap labors to exploit, and the other opportunity that we have as a country is high commitment by the Ethiopian government. We have a policy priority for introducing small-scale irrigation throughout the country. So this being said, some of the irrigation activities, the technologies that were introduced by Ethiopian farmers are drip irrigations, treadmill and motorized pump irrigations are some of the technologies that were used by the Ethiopian farmers. And this being said, I would like to emphasize some of the benefits that we are getting through the introduction of that we get from this 5% activity of small-scale irrigation practice. So the first one is dietary diversity. So before the introduction of small-scale irrigation, we were only able to produce grains such as cereal and legumes, but after the introduction of small-scale irrigation, we were able to produce vegetables and fruits that are nutritious and that can feed, that can improve the dietary of the woman as well as the child, and that also helped in reducing the amount of stunting that we are encountering as a country. The other benefit that were obtained was raised farmer incomes. Some of the farmers were also able to build their own houses, new houses. Before this, in some places, especially before the introduction of small-scale irrigation activities, they used to live with their livestock in the same house. But now with the introduction of small-scale irrigation, they were able to build new houses, and it also helped them to send their own children to school and to teach their children. And the other benefit is the farmers were able to deal with climate shocks. So with this climate shock, they don't need to really expect the rainfalls to come every year. They can produce anything they want with the availability of this small-scale irrigation. They even lend some amount of grains to their neighboring non-irrigation adapters. Also, after seeing their neighbors, non-adapters also start to build their own ponds, because sometimes some of the non-adapters are a little bit far from the water source area. But after seeing the benefit that their neighbors get from the introduction of small-scale irrigation, they were also benefited by the introduction of small-scale irrigation activities. So this being said, I would like to conclude by emphasizing the need for scaling up activities, because at this time we are only using the 5% of the Ethiopian irrigation potential, so we need to scale it up. And if we really want to eradicate poverty, and if we really want to engage other women as well as youth, we need to scale it up and we need to make it more sustainable. The second one is reducing the gender gap. We have traditional labor division between women and men, so we need to reduce that gender gap as well. And the third one, and the most important part, I would say, is integrating small-scale irrigation activity with other watershed management activities. Because most of the way it is done right now in Ethiopia is most of the irrigation activities are just done without integrating it with other watershed management activities. So in order to make the small-scale irrigation more sustainable, we need to integrate it with other watershed management activities so that we will improve the groundwater recharge and we will have more water throughout the year, so that they can they can irrigate their lands without having, without facing some irrigation water deficits. So by this, I would like to finish my speech, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Salamawit. Regasa, at the World Bank Group, we have so many projects. We have experienced, some are successful, some are less successful, and we are going towards maximizing finance for development. And the IFC, and I am at the IFC, we are also working on market development from an upstream point of view. What do you think what do you think as a World Bank Group, what have we gathered in terms of knowledge? Where do you think we still have some work, some studies, some research to do? How can we work with other partners? What are the next steps for the World Bank Group?
Thank you very much. I would like to pick up from where Salam left. That is the fact of irrigation development potential, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. As you might imagine, sub-Saharan Africa is the only region with a land frontier that can be irrigated significantly. There may be some potential even in US or in Eastern Europe and Eastern and Central Europe, but sub-Saharan Africa is the only thing. For example, if I would like to give you a number, different estimates say that the irrigation potential in Africa is 43 million. It can go down to 18 million. But the fact is there is a significant potential. But how do we realize this potential is how this farmer-led irrigation initiative we are talking about come in. Can we realize the sub-Saharan Africa's irrigation potential through the conventional public center approach? For us, taking the experience of other countries, particularly the Indian subcontinent and the northern China plains, we see that irrigation is not just a public sector effort. It's a private sector also driven largely. In fact, the majority of the irrigation developed in India is by private sector. And so what can we do for it? Why is this kind of approach not being implemented in sub-Saharan Africa? So we initiated a farmer-led irrigation concept approach. In fact, picking back on a range of institutions that have done over years, tried to study smallholder irrigations. You know, I can see the IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, the International Water Management Institute, FAO, different organizations have observed that the farmers themselves are not a passive taker. They are responding to markets, they are responding to climate shocks in their own way. And therefore, how can we capitalize on that? So the bank is trying to create a partnership of like-minded institutions, granulated at two levels. Some of the organizations are working on research and studies. I have named some of them. Some of them are concentrating on implementation. The implementation-minded organizations like the World Bank Group, International Finance Corporation, the also Daughtry Water and Food Institute. I know you have also some initiatives in Africa on pilot level. So the idea here is we are following two tracks of activities. The first thing is knowledge sharing and advocacy, because this is not a conventional approach. It's not accepted across the policymakers in Africa. So we need to do a kind of research-backed knowledge sharing. That's why we are collecting information from India, from northern China plain, and even from US, you know. It's also largely driven by private investment. So we are trying to influence the African policymakers. And for that, we are partnering with the African Union Commission, which is currently preparing a continental irrigation development strategy. That was for us a key entry point. We are strongly pushing for that policy document to contain farmer-led irrigation, smallholder irrigation, and that is, we are achieving that. So the end of the game is we are reaching the ministers, different ministers, African ministers, through that document, and they ultimately are going to domesticate it at country level. The other group of partnership we are creating is, like I said, the implementing agencies. We are trying to, for example, in the bank, we are trying to mainstream farmer-led irrigation on our pipeline and ongoing projects. We have started this in Uganda. We are going to start also in Kenya. AFC is experimenting with this in Kenya, Tanzania, if you may correct me. And also in West Africa, there is a Sahel irrigation project. We are trying to pilot the farmer-led irrigation agenda there. So generally, the bank is taking the approach very strongly to approach policy and the strategy for, influencing policy and the strategy, and also mainstreaming implementation in banks' own projects. That is the way we are trying to do.
Thank you very much, Regassa. Jenny, your work focuses on gathering information, gathering data, and helping farmers increase their resilience to climate change by working with nature, by helping them store water. Can you please tell us more about that?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me here, and I'll try to bring one perspective on the water access issue here for the panel and for the discussion. And I think that technologies are very good, and smallholder farmers, who are our biggest opportunity to actually get more food for the investments in research or even in technology that we're going to get. Getting more efficiency out of a system here in Nebraska or my own country is going to be way more expensive than trying to get that water use efficiency out of a smallholder farmer system. And I think that that is worth thinking about when we're trying to spend our money wisely. But one thing, one of the investments, or many of the investments we do for smallholder farmers is, like, for example, we heard about big data for the benefit of sustainable intensification. And unless we couple these other agronomic practices, good new seed varieties, fertilizer advice, with the access to water, together with the irrigation development, we're not going to get that best value out of the investment. And I wanted to share two such examples. And the challenge here is that smallholder farmers will invest in their business and do irrigation if there is a value for money. But getting access to water, and like Selam, you were hinting at in the Ethiopian context, getting access to water is not such a small matter. Is maybe something that we need to think about more in terms of public investments to help smallholder farmers being climate smart for the future. And I wanted to bring two examples from my work here with the Waterland Ecosystems program, where we have piloted some of these water storage examples to help farmers get access to water. And one of the examples is actually in investments that were done by very many donors and public sectors in the mid-80s and beginning of the 90s as a response to the severe droughts that happened in the beginning of 80s. And it's more than 1,000 small, medium-scale water storage scattered in the landscape. And I just included the map of Burkina Faso here. But actually, these small reservoirs are scattered all over West Africa, mainly in Ghana, Mali, and Burkina. But this is structures to build climate resilience for smallholder farmers, not just for cropping systems and irrigation purposes, but for other benefits as well. And the thing is that this infrastructure that was done at the time is now getting a little bit old and is being degraded because of different environmental and anthropogenic issues. And if we are going to build climate resilience around these structures and maintain and maybe even grow the benefits for farmers, we have to think about new design criteria, operation and maintenance to meet these new climate extremes. And we have to couple them with building capacity, including gender and youth. And I think that this is where the public sector has a responsibility, because these are community structures that are not necessarily managed so well from a private sector perspective, which is another very important actor on the ground with the farmers' fields. A second example of these kind of community structures, very much supported by public investments as well as farmers, is from South Asia, where we have a groundwater infiltration enhancing structure called bungalow. Sometimes they have a little bit of a different names from in different geographic spaces, but they are like constructed to capture and infiltrate the groundwater to allow the farmers to have a dry season irrigation, to thereby intensify the land use significantly. And both these examples are very context specific, but they are largely supported by private input in labor, as well as significant public investments, and these provide people with access to water in time and space to make sure that they make the best and build the climate resilience needed. So that's my examples that I wanted to bring to the panel today.
Thank you, Jenny. Ariana, a lot of your work focuses on how to work within communities and within a continuum of value chain. There you have an example on Rwanda and how you're trying to do that, but not alone. You're trying to do that with other partners. Please share some insights.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'll go into a little bit about who the Clinton Development Initiative is, talking about key challenges that we try to help farmers solve as our work relates to irrigation, and then some practices that have been working for us and what really hasn't been working for us. So the Clinton Development Initiative is an initiative of the Clinton Foundation that works in Malawi, Rwanda, and Tanzania, helping connect farming communities to business opportunities, helping them to essentially put more money in their pocket through agribusiness. Our programs focused around a 5-year engagement with communities. We help farmers, individual farmers, first and foremost form groups. We then layer in 2 years of basic agronomy training, helping them increase their crop yields, followed by 3 years of enterprise development training, figuring out how to have them hone in on business opportunities that make sense for them and their communities and the markets that exist in the countries that they're working in. Our work, as I said, tackles 4 key challenges. The first is access to quality training that makes sense for the farmers, trying to meet them at where they need us to help them. Also access to inputs, helping to make sure that farmers get the best quality seeds into their hands at the right time. We also look at access to financing, helping farmers form community banking groups as a first step before they are directly connected to MFIs or formal banking institutions, and then also access to markets. We essentially play matchmaker between the farming communities that we are there to support and the rural communities that we're working in, and the markets that exist, the business opportunities that exist for them to engage in directly. As it relates to irrigation, I've been working in specifically Rwanda for about 5 years. I see many of my friends and former colleagues in the audience, which is exciting for me. But the discussions that I've had with our communities over these last 5 years, specifically as it relates to irrigation, are hinged around affordability of irrigation systems for them, accessibility of these systems to them. Maybe they're only being sold in the capital, but they're focused out in the rural areas, and awareness of what kind of systems make sense for them and what they're growing. So a lot of our farmers are growing commodity crops, maize, soybeans, but maybe some of the systems are better suited at a small scale for horticulture crops. So trying to kind of bridge that knowledge gap as well. And then also they're saying to me and to our colleagues in Rwanda that there's not enough support on understanding how to best optimize some of these systems. So maybe there's people coming in to layer in the technology, but there's really not enough people there helping them maintain the systems and make sure that they're maximizing the potential of those systems. So for us, really what's been working is to talk about irrigation, and this has come through in a lot of the discussions already today, and I'm sure will continue to come up over the next 2 days, is that we really can't be talking about irrigation without talking about seeds and soil and infrastructure, access to markets, warehousing, all these other things, and vice versa. We need to talk about all of these challenges in a holistic system, bring together partners to tackle these challenges together. No one of us can do this alone. And so I'm looking forward to continuing to talking about how we can better do that and share some examples with you about our partnerships. And what's really not working for us is working in silos. We're really limiting our potential and our ability to be able to help the farming communities we're seeking to help if we don't talk to each other, share best practices, learn from each other, be able to step up and say, we made a mistake and maybe we could course correct and think about a better way to do this. And so I'm looking forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you, Ariana. Petra, I know you have a presentation for us. At the International Water Management Institute, you have great research that I know that every time we look at a project in any country, we look at the research you've done on the subject, even if it's in another market, but it gives us an indication of what we should keep an eye on. And your presentation and your work focuses on, we are going to, renewable energy is the future, and solar water pumps are becoming more affordable for farmers. But we need to be careful. So please tell us how is that done?
Okay, thank you very much. Hello? Yes, it is working. And I think what I wanted to bring to today's discussion is very much indeed what we have been talking about. It's an holistic approach that, of course, needs to address the context of a particular farmer in a particular geographic setting, under particular access to finance, et cetera, and yes, there is high expectations about solar, both from the energy sector, but also from the agricultural sector, the water sector, and therefore it has a high promise to fulfill. But of course, how do we do that? And when we talk about farmer-led irrigation, we need to really think about the different components. So what I wanted to bring as a point of discussion today is, how do we make farmer-led irrigation, such as potentially solar, equitably accessible, economically profitable, but also environmentally sustainable. And a particular challenge with farmer-led irrigation is, of course, as it would go to scale, how do we then preserve our water resources? How do we think about this holistically? And there is a lot of effort at the moment, taking by the private sector, by public sector and donor, looking at what are the financial mechanisms to, for example, reduce the prohibitive upfront costs. What could be mechanisms to enhance social inclusion? For example, the work in Nepal, where they look at, if a woman owns the land, they have additional access to subsidies, compared to male irrigators. And then there are cases like in India where they look at on-grid solutions for solar as a potential incentive to safeguard groundwater. And whereas those different modalities for solar do try to address specific components, we still need to think about and create that evidence that kind of looks at the other components as well. So for example, if we take the on-grid system example in India, where you have, an upfront cost that the farmer has to buy in, you have the government subsidies, you have access to loans, and the farmer, as he's connected to the grid, can sell also his solar power when he doesn't irrigate. Sounds like a good story, right? But then, does it really help the incentive of safeguarding the groundwater? What if you start increasing your land in your community because you're actually saving on that particular plot, right? So what is actually the larger scale implications, and how do you scale up such modalities that do actually require quite a public interest. And then for off-grid systems, which is again in the sub-Saharan African context very relevant, where still, you know, by 2040, 500 million people will not have access to the grid. Again, great example where solar has a big promise to fulfill, to provide access to water. But as those would go to scale, how could we then ensure that the regulations, the policies, and the different institutional needs are actually also addressed to do that sustainable? So we already heard this morning about, you know, the digital revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, all about data. How do we make use of that data? How can we do that in the context of sub-Saharan Africa? And then we just talked about, you know, linking it to markets, you know, and all that is pretty much there. But how do you integrate all these different puzzle pieces, again, to provide the best situation for a particular smallholder farmer? And I think that's kind of what I wanted to bring to the discussion today. It's not only about providing access to information that fits the context, but also how could we use the data then to monitor, you know, to feed back actually what's going on the ground, to create that actual evidence, whether we are using our water resources most efficiently, both from an economic and an environmental perspective. I think about water accounting. You know, there's so much out there, but how can we also bring that into the farmer-led irrigation context?
Thank you, Petra. Rob, USAID is implementing different components of how to increase smallholders' production. One of which is farmer-led irrigation. USAID is also establishing coalitions with other partners because we all know and we've known for some time that we cannot be in everywhere and we cannot do everything by ourselves. And in some places, actually, we've discovered as a World Bank group that there are some agencies and some institutions that have more knowledge and more presence in some markets than the World Bank Group does, or its usual partners do. Can you please tell us more about your activities in farmer-led irrigation, but also tell us how can we build coalitions and utilize everyone's strength better, as opposed to trying to learn everything by ourselves and trying to implement everything in silos. Thank you.
Thank you, Mantaha, and good morning, everybody. The last part of your question, I think, will also be something that we can circle back to at the end, having listened to a whole range of perspectives across the panel. I'd like to start by just sharing an update about our organization and its changes that it's going through. This is all framed by our administrator, Mark Green's focus on the journey to self-reliance, and very much embedded in the journey to self-reliance is what Mantaha was just talking about. It's not going to be us that does everything. It's really about finding ways to catalyze and free up investment, mostly from the private sector, but also from the public sector in our partner countries themselves. So, the Bureau for Food Security is becoming the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. It will have 4 centers. One of them will be agriculture, where we will continue to focus on things to raise productive potential and reduce risk, and hence drive that investment on farm and off. And that is very much, irrigation is, I mean, just the best example because it allows you to do both, reduce risk and raise potential. A nutrition center that'll be looking at a whole range of things from enteric health and environmental enteropathy to a diversified portfolio of more nutritious foods that leads to diversified, healthier diets and food safety. And then a resilience center, which is, these have all sort of been there, but they're being pulled out and elevated, is really about risk, and it's about the idea, sort of a paradigm of finding an ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. We go into places where there's recurrent humanitarian crisis, so think of the Horn of Africa, think the Sahel, and trying to discern the best ways to reduce long-term risk and the vulnerability to shocks. So it pulls us to drier areas, but also areas where water is a critical constraint. And then finally, the water Center is new coming into the Bureau. So this is essentially the Water for the World Act. I think most of you have heard of that if you're familiar with the U.S. context. And it is primarily on water, sanitation, and hygiene. So this is the fact that they're now joining us is causing the rest of the Bureau to think more intentionally about water and the potential synergies. I was delighted when our lead in WASH the other day said, you know, agriculture, it makes profits. Maybe we could figure out a way to connect with those investments that would also have a WASH payoff, but that the profit driver in agriculture could help drive investment that would benefit WASH as well. So that's the kind of thing we're going to be thinking of. The whole multi-use aspect in most of the communities we're working in on farmer-led irrigation, multi-use is almost baked in somehow, and figuring out how to optimize that. So we're in the middle of that, and I hope next year at this conference, if Peter and Molly let us invite us to, we will share hopefully some progress by putting all of these what I would call foundational aspects of development. Food and water security are really foundational, and so we're excited about that. So farmer-led irrigation is such an exciting area for us when we think about animal source foods, vegetables, fruits, legumes, fodder. All of these are water intensive, but they're also employment intensive, knowledge intensive, but they're also very profitable. So they're very good targets for private investment to come into. So what we're trying to do is harness changes that are already beginning, and we're seeing this increasingly in sub-Saharan Africa, where urban money is coming back into rural systems. And you see the growth of medium-sized farms. Tom Jane from Michigan State University writes about this. And it's fascinating because the sweet spot for spillovers from the more well-endowed financed farms to the poorer neighbors and smaller farms is 5 to 10 hectares. So that's really where we see this spillover. What do we see? We see market aggregation, both input and output markets, but also service provision, right? Harvesting, mechanization, irrigation. So this is a very exciting trend, and I think the idea is, how can we try to make this as pro-poor and pro-inclusive growth as possible. And as I said, many of these value chains, these higher value value chains, are employment intensive. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities to meet the growing demands. Again, this is one of my favorite themes. This is really ultimately about capitalizing undercapitalized systems. We are seeing investments in infrastructure. We're seeing economies that we're working with growing so that roads and grids are expanding. And that is basically got to be accompanied now by a shift in sub-Saharan Africa from land extensification to land intensification. And again, water is going to be key, as is other aspects of total factor productivity that was mentioned this morning. Genetics, information about markets, information about weather, natural resource management. But we also have a lot of poverty and undernutrition, child stunting, still in hinterland areas. The areas that aren't as close to Dar es Salaam, the areas that aren't having the market sheds. So what do we do there? How do we get into that? And I think, frankly, that question is part of what our resilience agenda is about. Those more remote areas where maybe the infrastructure isn't, the grid isn't. So this is where something like solar irrigation comes in, because it's basically a leapfrogging technology. Also things around water points for pastoralists and such, if we're talking about really dry areas. But I think solar has a lot of excitement around it. It's getting durable. The pumps are coming down in the price quality point. It's becoming increasingly competitive. Has a really long term, if you look over a horizon, it's much more competitive. And the life of the panels is very good, like 25 years or something. So the other thing is some of these pumps are lightweight, so you don't run into the thievery problems the security issues in the field. They can be moved more readily or taken back to the farmstead or a safe place overnight in a way that maybe big diesel equipment is much harder to do. But I want to also back up and talk about a more incremental approach. Let's think a little bit about the Guinea savanna in West Africa, where you have monomodal rainfall. You have a lot of people that we're trying to work with getting 3/4 of a ton per hectare. This is a prescription for poverty, undernutrition, a hungry season, and vulnerability. What we're finding is, and my colleague Jerry Glover, working with the Sustainable Intensification Innovation Lab led by Kansas State and our partners in the CGIAR, are seeing that what we can see is a stepwise progression in that region, where just bringing in good agronomy, not risky stuff, line planting, spacing, you can double yields. And then you can bring in fertilizer. And when you get to about 2 tons per hectare, that's when people will start to bring in capital like small-scale irrigation. And then people start growing fodder, they start growing vegetables. They're not irrigating the whole farm. Maybe they're irrigating a 20th of a hectare, but during the dry season, that can generate all kinds of benefits, including integration of livestock and more biomass in the system. So that's a very exciting thing, and my hope is that organic growth will move northwards such that infrastructure will follow it, and we can try to connect those more remote, more vulnerable areas where shocks are really a part of life and to markets in ways that will increase their resilience. So even some water can be transformative. This high value diversification, the income and the nutrition advantages are very exciting to us. And the interaction of infrastructure with irrigation investment. The one thing I'd like to say, and this is where our innovation lab on small scale irrigation comes in, and the point has been made by my colleagues here, we have to do this sustainably. If we blow it, if we go in there and everybody just puts out their solar panels with no connection to how fast that water table's going down, we'll all be in trouble. That's why in India, the really exciting thing is when you put the panels with the grid, because people sell it back then. It's an incentive to conserve the resource. So we have to do this right. We have to understand the hydrology. We have to understand the policies. Ethiopia has removed the tariffs on imported pumps, which is great. So there's a growing recognition that this is a great opportunity. And then finally, that multi-use, the learning agenda around the intersection between farmer-led irrigation, drinking water, hygiene, safe handling of One Health with respect to animals, and food safety. So thanks, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Jenny, your work is in trying to gather information to address farmer-led irrigation needs now, but it's also challenging us to think and to anticipate what could future concerns be in terms of climatic changes, environmental changes, but also market shifts. Will the crops we grow today going to be needed in the future? Will they feed the people? Will they generate incomes? What are some of the research you've done in this field, and what have you experimented? What were the results, and what do you think has worked and has not worked that will help us, that will help guide some of our efforts based on the data collection?
Based on the data collection, I think we're facing a hugely uncertain future, and actually, the good thing is that we have a huge private sector trying to improve our varieties and our seeds and the material that farmers can farm, which is great. But again, I want to come back to what do we need to do in the open-sourced research institutes and the public spaces to build that climate resilience. And it's terms of generating the knowledge that is like objective and evidence-based, that maybe the private sector is contributing to, but I think that we need also to have knowledge developed here. And then, of course, when we come back to the water infrastructure, and Rob, yeah, I agree, there's a lot of roads being built and lots of electrical grids, but when we look at the water infrastructure, for example, in Sub-Saharan Africa, there is still an underinvestment in water storage that will eventually hamper this farmer-led irrigation development that is happening and that is picking up rapidly with the private sector and generating huge interest from the banks and from other players on the ground. So yeah, what does the evidence tell us? The evidence tells us that we are in a highly precarious, uncertain future, and we cannot envision what that future will be, but we know that there is a range of things, including strengthening the water use and enabling water access for example, for multiple use or farmer-led irrigation, that can build that resilience, in particular in those areas that are already under water scarcity challenges and that are facing even more rapid challenges in the future with heat stress as well as more water scarcity.
Thank you, Jenny. Rigasa, studies show that if we want to eradicate poverty, investment in agriculture is 11 times more likely to help us achieve these goals. What are some of the World Bank projects? And of course, to increase agricultural productivity, you need to work on irrigation. What are some of the World Bank farmer-led irrigation initiatives in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, currently I just would like to build on what I have said before. That is the bank is now trying to mainstream the farmer-led irrigation approach in its ongoing and pipeline projects, as I said. The way we approach this is that there are two issues here. People are saying that if it is a farmer-led irrigation, let's just leave it like that. It is a purely private sector initiative. Why do we care about this initiative? We are saying that this is not a right approach. The experience from India, for example, how the farmer-led irrigation or the private irrigation flourished is that there was a concerted effort from the national central government, from the state government, and also many NGOs, World Vision, Catholic Relief, and a huge effort was there really to unleash the potency of irrigation in reducing poverty and food security. So in Africa also what we are trying to do is we are beginning from a market assessment. For example, the way we are doing it, just to give you a practical example, in Uganda, we assess the market situation, which includes we begin from what is the state policy and the strategy. What are the policies and the strategies? We want to link to that. And for example, in Uganda, their export sector is not competitive because of the very stringent regulatory conditions from the main destinations of export, like Europe. So they have to be meeting a certain standard, and they cannot meet with the business as usual. They have to. It has to be irrigated. If it is irrigated, you can trace it. You can have a continuous supply. You can have an handle on the quality of the thing. So I'm just saying that we begin from the policy conditions in that country, and then we see who are the partners. You know, we identify the commodities. We identify the commodities. Who are the partners who are engaged on off-taking of these commodities? Who are the partners who are engaged in distribution of these technologies? So we work back from there. And so we come up with a commodity that is potentially rewarding for the farmer. The market is readily available. We assure that. And then, okay, what is the possibility for these farmers to increase their production? Irrigation is one. Of course, we have talked about the seed and fertilizer and other crop protection technologies. But for irrigation input, who are the equipment suppliers? Who are the installers? Who are the drillers if the water source is groundwater? We assessed that. And to our dismay, the cost is very high. I mean, it's not really the way it is reported in reports here and there. When you practically see, mainly what's reported is equipment cost in the shop, but it doesn't factor in the cost of transporting it down to the place where you are going to install irrigation. The cost of source development is not included. Even the cost of taking the water from a source to the field is not included. When you consider this, it is a bit costly. It's costly, particularly in relation to the experiences elsewhere, like India and something like that. This is, we were told, this is because there is no scale now. When it is a scale, so that this is all justification for the involvement of the government at the beginning, actually. So when we have a scale and when the number of people who are engaged in this kind of irrigation, then the market situation the competition will beat it down. So, and then the other angle is the financing. Financing is a real problem, really. So what we are trying to do is we are formulating a kind of grant. We have a 50% grant, and a 50% the farmer will generate. We'll have to provide. We made in such a way that at least 10% should be really installed, provided by the farmer. The rest of the 40%, we are partnering with IFC, who are really very skilled in pitching in formulating the financial mechanism. They are connecting the farmers to the existing financial institutions, private or public financial institutions. So the way we are trying to approach is really a holistic approach of delivering irrigation at the farm. It's not just telling the farmers to go and buy equipment. It's more than that. So we are approaching it that way. The principle is that there should be a working a market access, there should be a financial access, and there should be also a training, technical assistance. We would like to embed also a training of how to maintain, they have to be able to do some of the minor mailing. And the other thing is also, in most of these countries, policy-wise, they are really talking about youth unemployment. That is the number one issue for the African governments now, across board. The youth unemployment is a huge liability, even for political stability and the safety, the peace and safety of the country. And that's why you see also a lot of people trying to come to US, to Europe, also the migration. It's not actually, well, that is a pull factor because they are anticipating a better life here. But even within the country, the younger population are swarming to the cities because it's not because the cities are providing them a better economic opportunities, it's just a distress movement, right? So that's why we are saying that the farmer-led irrigation should be really responding to the contemporaneous policy agendas of the African governments, and it has to contribute to the sustainable development goals. And it has the potential to do that.
Thank you, Rigasa. Ariana, we know governments have limited resources, and maybe, Rigasa, you can tell us later during the conversation, how does the World Bank work with governments who were focused on large scheme irrigation, and now we're trying to shift their priorities to farmer-led, private sector-led irrigation. But Ariana, because governments have limited resources, and because we know that development cannot happen without it being private sector-led, and the farmer is a private sector entity, how does the Clinton Foundation work to encourage, to promote, to strengthen private sector-led irrigation and development?
Thanks. Hello? Great. Okay, so I think first and foremost, it's important for us to understand what's driving these private sector business actors. For us, it was opening up conversations between our farmer groups and the markets, the people that were buying their products from them, to understand, where were we falling short? Why were you not able to buy from smallholder farmers? Why were smallholder farmers side selling? How do we strengthen these relationships between these entities? And we focus really, because of the discussions that we had between the entities, around the amount of crops that farmers are producing, the quality of those crops, and the consistency of the production, because we found that those were key pain points between the discussions and relationships between those two entities. We're really trying to make it easier for these farmer groups to connect directly to the private sector. As I keep talking about farming communities, we really don't work with individual farmers. We encourage farmers to work in groups because of the feedback that we've gotten from individual farmers as groups providing stronger safety nets if they're working together in groups, but also because of this private sector discussions that we've been having for many decades in the countries that we're working in around the fact that they cannot be expected to source or be encouraged to source from smallholder farmers if they're buying from an individual farmer. They have much more incentive if they're going to be sourcing from groups of farmers that have central points of aggregation, that maybe have warehousing infrastructure. It kind of, you meet each other halfway. So I think that's really, really important. We're constantly also looking for opportunities to connect our farmers to the private sector and vice versa. And so I think just kind of being out there, keep your ears open about the opportunities to bridge the gap and strengthen those systems is critical. We also, as some of you in the audience know, do have experience in the private sector as the Clinton Foundation. We owned and operated commercial farms in Malawi, Rwanda, and Tanzania, and so we really understand some of the challenges that those private sector actors face and bring that into the work that we're doing to help navigate those challenges now. We also understand commercialization, challenges that smallholders face in commercializing their production because of the work that we had done in that same space as well. We were producing seeds on our commercial farms. We're now trying to empower our farmers to start seed businesses and be seed producer themselves. And because of our experiences doing it ourselves in the countries that we've worked in, we're able to kind of share these insights with them and try to help set them up to be successful. We're also trying to make the business case for private sector led development. We want to kind of help the private sector see the opportunities that exist in putting more skin in the game and investing more into infrastructure between where the smallholder farmers are producing and where they're expected to sell into. And so this is kind of one example of that would be the issue around financing. So we talk a lot about connecting farmers to financial institutions. Well, we found that there's a really big gap between farmers that are individuals saving for themselves and connecting them with MFIs. The interest rates are really high, financial literacy is really low, and so how do we kind of bridge that gap? And so we were working with, I'm sure many of you have heard of CARES, the SLA model, but we try to help farmers form community banking groups in their local communities so that they can get into the practice of saving. We also help them in this process through giving our farmers input loan packs that they're expected to repay, and using that transaction between us and them, using our nonprofit money to try to make the business case to the private sector or to the input suppliers or to the to get more involved in that case, because if we can prove through investing our money in the system that farmers are able to repay their loans, why should a private sector actor not come in and be doing the same thing for us? We have a finite amount of resources and human capacity as the nonprofit sector. The private sector should see that there is a viable business case for them to come in, and we want to put our money towards proving that to them.
Thank you. Petra, we see that solar-powered irrigation pumps are now available everywhere. Their upfront costs have decreased. There is there is an understanding of what they can bring. There is also some systems that you showed us earlier where they can sell excess energy back to the grid. The example of India, and I think Pakistan was also thinking about this. So why is solar irrigation still not as disseminated as we thought 5 years ago? We thought that it would be everywhere. What does your institute, the development partners, and the equipment suppliers who are offering more efficient systems, who are linking solar to drip, and who are also offering monitoring tools where, you know, if you're selling the system, you can monitor how much water do you need to irrigate, so you're not over-irrigating, over-extracting water. Why are we not able to bridge that market fragmentation?
Wow, that's a big question to answer in how many minutes? Well, I think there's tremendous efforts already being done, you know. I mean, there are some countries which really are having that private sector, public sector, donor, and then the research community coming together and figuring out really how to increase that access from the supply side, how to make best use of the technology in a specific context, and trying to already think ahead and make sure that this is done in an environmentally sustainable way. However, in Africa, I think there are still a lot of the different barriers that, and again, it's very context specific, where in one country it may be the supply, it may be the access to the actual solar pump. In other countries, it's maybe the main driver is the financial access, you know, and the fact that the microfinance institutions, as they are set out, are not really accommodating yet for more expensive technologies, because yes, the price of solar panels have come down, etc. But they are still more expensive than, for example, a rope and washer, right? So I think at the moment, and that's pretty much what comes across here in the panel, it's about really bringing things together. And that can be done through various different initiatives. And I mean, there are a lot of initiatives already ongoing. It can be through dialogue platforms, etc. And I think there are some good examples already from the agricultural sector. Think about the Sustainable Rice Platform, you know, where the private sector, the public sector, the UN agencies actually already come together to see how can we sustainably produce, you know, more rice more efficiently, but at the same time at landscape level being more environmentally sustainable. And I think this is very much what the Farmer-led irrigation initiative also is about bringing those different agents together with their strengths and thinking through how we can do that and how we can, under a given context, still have a holistic approach to make that happen.
Thank you. So I will ask for your forgiveness, because I will assume that Selamawit is the youngest amongst all the panelists. This is an assumption. Selamawit, you represent the youngest of people working on agriculture. What do you think we should do as leaders in this sector to attract more youth, to attract more women to work in agriculture, to work on irrigation?
Okay, so when it comes to women and youth, both in developing countries, the problem is they have little access to land, livestock, and human capital in general. So in order to deal with those problems, providing women and youth with great access to land, inputs such as fertilizer, also credits in order to allow them to be able to produce more food is essential. Also, on the top of that, providing women and youth with great, linking women to agriculture value chains from production all the way to processing and marketing is also important. The other one is women and youth they have little training and they also have little access to technologies. So if we want to succeed on involving women and youth, we need to provide them the access for the training and technologies so that they can produce more. The other thing, specifically more in Ethiopia or in other developing country, most important sectors, especially for small-scale irrigations, they work in a very fragmented way. For example, the agriculture, water, and the cooperative, they work in a very fragmented way. So if we want to bring more youth and women, we need to really work together, and these offices need to come together and work together to allow more youth and women to participate on agriculture. So the other thing is we have little infrastructure and the economy is not developed, especially in the rural areas. Therefore, in order to develop women and youth participation on this. We need to also improve the infrastructure as well as the economy of the rural population. Thank you.
So, Rigasa, just to close the question on how does the World Bank work with governments, and this is especially important for sub-Saharan Africa, where governments select the establishment of large-scale irrigation as opposed to farmer-led irrigation. Do you see a shift in this in the government strategies? If not, what is the World Bank doing to diversify the type of irrigation that the farmers can tap into?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the strands of the bank and its partners. You know, I mean, I have to talk now not only about the bank, a whole consortium of institutions working on farmer-led irrigation, including USAID and also many others. So one of the activity is actually what we call policy and advocacy job. The purpose of that is really to influence policymakers, basically boiling down to the national governments who are not really aware or do not see, could not directly see the value in these small holders. And you know, it's not an easy exercise actually as we think, because if you are designing an irrigation project of a big infrastructure, you know the source, the project site, you exactly know the project site, you exactly know the design parameters you needed to deliver water to the farmers, right? And it involves also a lot of contractual arrangements, a lot of money involved, and that's the kind of thing that's naturally appreciated, not just in Africa, also all over, I mean, even in India. So we have to work on the mindset. Okay, what is the objective of the line ministry, water and agriculture? It is to increase irrigated area. And we are trying to sell the idea that then if the objective is to increase irrigation water service, there are many different ways of doing that. That is, you have the large scale, publicly driven one, you have small scale one, you have medium scale one, and you have also this farmer-led irrigation, you know, what they tend to call Mickey Mouse irrigation. You know, is Claudia there? Yeah, so for them it is a Mickey Mouse irrigation. It's something, you know, you see here and there. It can't add up. And we are trying to bring a solid international knowledge in the form of document and try to present to them. We have done this in many occasions in Washington, D.C., in partnership with USAID, Nebraska also. We had our first meeting in D.C., January 2018. We brought many partners. We have tried to do that. And secondly, we followed up that advocacy and policy action in Rwanda, Kigali, as part of the Africa Agri-Revolution Forum, which is happening annually. And it involves close to 3,000 people coming from across the world. And I think you were a panelist there, Rab, and we really managed to create a kind of demand from the participants. And to our satisfaction, there is what they call, after this kind of forum, usually there is a presidential summit, and this farmer-led irrigation was mentioned there in the communique. So that is, you know, we are trying to work from the upper work. So we are doing advocacy work, but advocacy based on empirical evidence, not just for the sake of advocacy. So we are doing studies, we are relying on our partners who are doing research. We are synthesizing this information and conveying to the actors like the ministries of water and agriculture. Yeah. And one thing I would like to add on the sustainability issue, that's also something which is also a concern. We are saying that we should not postpone. You know, India is finish the, you know, destroy the water resource and then think about it afterwards. That is not the style we are trying to propagate here. We need to consider the sustainability issues right up front. That is how we are, the recharge, the aquifer recharge movement, the watershed management, it should be embedded in there. And also technologies, innovations are allowing us to measure actually how much the farmers are really withdrawing, the Internet of Things, everything. So the first thing is actually to measure and know how individual farmers, what the amount of water they are using. We can know that now. If we know that, then we can also venture into influencing, providing incentive, through pricing. Why not? So these are the things also.
Thank you, Regasa. Rob, we heard so many exciting experiments, projects, ideas about how to promote the uptake of farmer-led irrigation that is profitable, sustainable, and helps farmers reach their productivity goals and objectives. What do you think of these ideas, and how do you think we should, what are the areas we should focus on as a group of researchers, development partners, private sector, irrigation companies? What is our action plan, basically?
Thanks, Montaha. One observation I would start with is that it's the very poor who can benefit the most from even incremental changes. So for example, I mentioned a family getting 3/4 of a ton per hectare. If they can move to 1.5 tons, they're still poor, but they're a lot better off than they were when they were maybe at the 30 or 40 cents a day. Maybe they're at 80 or cents or $1 a day, and they've started on a right trajectory. So I don't think we want to lose sight of that. Having said that, I think the entryway needs to recognize that there are differentially endowed farmers, even in some of the very challenging areas. There are people with more land, maybe more money, maybe they're leading the way in adopting new technologies, including small-scale irrigation. So we're very excited about really trying to discern the best ways to get spillovers, to use a water reference, into the surrounding poorer farms. So that's one thing that I would observe. And then in some of the other areas, and I think this has been mentioned, where it was very interesting to hear the comments about how we really need concerted efforts of both the public and the private sector. But what's the private sector look like in some of these areas we're working in? And ultimately, it comes at some level, that private sector is the farmers themselves. So this question of farmer organizations and how to drive collective action, because we're all concerned about the sustainability of the resource. I mean, that's a recurrent theme through everyone's comments. And if we blow this, we're really going to miss a huge opportunity. So we have to do it right. So, getting the behavior change, the knowledge, the sense of shared responsibility, I think those are some of the challenges. And, that's another place where our small-scale irrigation lab, that's Texas A&M and IMI partnering with each other, are really looking to understand the socioeconomic drivers that will help determine behavior and hopefully good behavior in terms of conserving the resource. Another thing that we heard recurrently is finance, and that one is fascinating. As I said, we see some things happening where people have gone to the city, made money, and then come back and invest, which is fine. And let's figure out how to optimize those situations when they occur. But there may be other situations where we want to have a more concerted approach, the way Regasa mentioned, that really tries to think about how to get capital into a community that doesn't have that necessarily happening. So that's another area, I think, for our shared learning going forward. So those are just some thoughts off the top of my head. Let me just see if I wrote down anything. Oh, on behavior change. it can happen. One of the big secrets, and it's not a secret, but it shouldn't be, is that in the last 15 years, average crop yields in Ethiopia have gone up 150%, and in some crops, they've doubled. So, tripled. I'm sorry, 150% is more than doubled. So that's across the country. That's extraordinary. It's actually a faster rate of gain than India had in the Green Revolution. So that's behavior change. It's a lot about fertilizer. It's also about other things, better agronomy, better seeds. Fertilizer is huge. So, I like to keep that in mind as a positive example that, a payoff that's visible, and let's face it, with water, payoff is visible often very quickly. We can drive this change.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you to all of you for your insights, your sharing your experiments, sharing what has worked, what your future activities will be. I know that we will keep an eye on what you are initiating in your respective fields. IFC, we usually follow the researchers and follow the development partners, because when you have worked on certain markets, then the private sector can follow. And what I mean by the private sector is the aggregators, the financial institutions, and all these big investment companies, the market for the farmers who are going to hopefully increase their productivity. We have 11 minutes left to our session, and I would like to open it up for any questions from the audience. We have 3 microphones, and I'm happy. Oh, there are microphones over there. Okay, so please, yes. I was going to come and give you my microphone, but please go ahead.
Wei Liao, Michigan State University. Very nice talk. Learn all those, perspectives and all those, experiences again. And one of the things, because this is for, the farm-led agriculture, and particularly in that, description mentioned, most of, farms around the world are small farms, and 2 hectares in that neighborhood. And all those kind of research and technology development, no matter solar powered or some other things, are very wonderful, amazing. But I really want to kind of hear from the panel about educational piece. And those farms are not big farms like 100, several hundred hectare lands. They have the engineer or some people, even in some very poor countries. We do stuff at Michigan State. We do quite a bit. We do have a USAID full labs, the running and MSU. So, and how could we keep those kind of educational piece, longevity, all those kind of stuff after the project finished, and how could we maintain those things? I think it's a very, very big challenge. We do things in Central America, Southern America, Africa, Southeast Asia. That's kind of things we trying to solve, but we really don't have very good solutions on that piece. I really want to listen a little bit from audience or from the panel, their perspective from different agencies on the education piece. Thank you.
Yeah, I will try to approach this from practical point of view. You are right. It's not just enough providing technologies and organizing pieces here and there. That is, the terminology we use is usually capacity building, not educational for the first. So in any project, we have a technical assistance component, which usually deals with capacity building. For example, in the context of farmer-led irrigation, when you are bringing in technologies like pump, for example, we need to train youths, who are tech savvy, to be a professional spare part providers or maintainers or repairers, something like that. So this is something which is usually part of the project component, and it is very important. Yeah, to be sure.
I think this was a very valid comment, and thank you very much. I think that actually, if we are going to meet the future that is going to work on these issues in 20 years' time, we need to train them now. And I see that quite a few universities, both in Europe that previously has provided, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa with irrigation expertise and engineers, as well as African universities themselves now currently going through a huge transformational change because of the population growth and youth load. There is actually a downsizing on agricultural agronomy, including agriculture engineering issues in the programs, moving more towards natural resource type of programs rather than the specific engineering that might be needed for the future. So I would welcome that there was a survey done on African education programs in particular, both on academic as well as vocational, to see what are the curriculums currently being in place and offered, so we are sure that we're building the future capacity on these issues.
I think to add on what the two colleagues are saying, I think indeed building the capacity into projects can be very powerful. And to give an example actually on the Innovation Lab for Small-Scale Irrigation, where we worked with the national universities in country, they actually changed their curriculum. They actually started, looking at irrigation at a department that before was only looking at water resources engineering. So there are also ways to, I think, design now your projects in such a way, and not only at the university level, but also when you start working with the private sector in a project around scaling, look at innovation scholarships where the next generation of youth can actually work directly with the private sector, get this first hands-on experience in a solar technology company or anything, that is. And I think it's about redesigning a little bit how we think about capacity building from the farm on the ground all the way to the next generation of leaders, I guess.
And I would like to add something about what the IFC is doing in terms of capacity building. So the farmers are trained, and the off-takers, who are the aggregators, the markets are trained also, so they provide this service to their supply chains. But also financial institutions are trained to understand the seasonality of working with agricultural producers. So the payment of the loan, if they ever have a loan, is not going to be done on a monthly basis. It's going to be done based on the crop and the season of when these farmers are getting the income. So as Regasa said, every project we develop has a knowledge management, capacity building, two separate components. The capacity building is the beneficiaries and the people who are providing services, and then the knowledge management is sharing with other partners. What are we doing? What are you doing? What has worked, and how can we work better to leverage each other's activities? So this is a very important component for IFC's projects as well. I'm going to leave it to the next question. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Blanche Wutera. I'm a Rwandan student here at the university. Great talk, by the way. It was great insights. I don't know about the others, but we had a great time listening to you guys, your interactions. So my question is about shared irrigation projects where people are put in a place so that the government can secure funding for irrigation infrastructure for all of them to fall either under a certain number of pivots, things like that. So some countries have like food security goals that they want to get to, producing corn, things like that. But farmers are realizing that there's more profitability in horticulture, so both nutrition-wise and also money-wise, and securing markets, like future markets, even before that. Do you guys seem to have so much insights? Do you have creative ways that you may suggest that we can merge that nutrition and also meeting food security goals for countries? Thank you.
So based on research, survey research from Waterland and Ecosystems done by IFPRI, for example, and Claudia here, she can brief you more on that. They show that irrigation provides farmer with income so they can buy the food that they need when they want. That's the main pathway of food security improvement. So I think that it's the market that will drive and provide the incentive for a smallholder farmer to do the irrigation.
Yeah. So I think this is a very important question. If I may understand, you touched upon some of the critical issues, the crop selection. Who should be in charge? What to grow, when to grow. That is basically the farmer-led irrigation philosophy. We believe that that's why we do the value chain analysis. There should not be any kind of prescription. It should be basically as much as possible based on market access, based on what farmers really think it works. So the irrigation has two pathways through which nutrition, three pathways actually. The first is now when you introduce irrigation, production increases. And that is it. And then also income increases. Through the income increase, they can source nutritious food for either from the market if it is there. And the third route is actually, that is where we have to talk about merging agriculture and water supply and sanitation. You can imagine in a household where there is enough nutritious food to supply, but if the health is not there, if the individuals in a household cannot utilize the nutrients, the intake because of parasites, poor drinking water supply, that won't be success. So there is a need for merging these objectives. It's not just enough really supplying farmers having a good supply of nutritious food. They have to be healthy to process that one. That is what I wanted to say. Crop selection is actually, the government program. So there is some degree of private initiative. The whole objective here is to unleash individual farmers' entrepreneurial skill. And that is when you leave most of the decisions to them and help them also make the right decisions, not in a controlled way, but in a decision-making mode.
So we only have 30 seconds left. So if we can have only one question, and then you're welcome to join the panelists to ask them questions either right after the session or during lunch or during other networking sessions. And I know you were there first. Yes. So I'm sorry. Do you mind?
Yeah. Me or somebody else?
He came to the microphone first. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Oh, was it? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Apologies. Can we have more questions with the panelists after the session? I mean, you're welcome to stay. Just I don't want to come between people and lunch. I don't want to be that person. Please go ahead.
Hello. So my name is Charles, and I'm a CEO and co-founder of Volta Irrigation. So I'm an entrepreneur myself, and this question has been a burning question on my heart. So I know a lot of the speakers here, and thank you for the topic you are discussing. Really interested in that. Most of the speakers here have been talking about building a sustainable model around the whole ecosystem and irrigation and everything, but I haven't heard about building a business model around it. One thing I've noticed in this entrepreneurial space is a lot of these institutions and organizations do come, they create solutions for the communities, but then they don't build a sustainable model around it in terms of business. And so when they leave, these models fail. When they leave, these solutions crumble. And then when young entrepreneurs like myself, when we come into the space, we find it difficult to actually convince these farmers on the ground to buy into our solutions. The reason being that they have the fear that we're also just going to live just like the international organizations and institutions. And these institutions are the ones that are having access to the funds, to the investment. We lack it. We have we've come up with innovative solutions. We are trying to build a business out of it. And it's so close to our hearts because we believe our lives depend on it. And so we want to see it succeed. But unfortunately, we don't have access to these big funds. We don't have access to these big investments. And so even when we come in to convince these farmers, it's a whole lot of issues. It's a challenge we have to deal with, to be able to get rid of the mindset and be able to help let them buy into what we are trying to build and build a sustainable model from it. So I want to know your thoughts on that. What do you think about the business model built around the whole thing?
Sure, I'll make it really quick. First of all, I think it's really important to point out that without you and your business being successful, our farmers can't be successful and vice versa. So we need people like you and sustainable solutions built around your intervention or your business to succeed for the long-term sustainability of our farmers being able to succeed when they access the technology. And I think the important thing, again, to point out is that part of, I think, what a lot of us are trying to do is to set the farming communities up for success in terms of how they can connect best with the technology. We want our farmers to succeed, and to do that, we need you to succeed and vice versa. So I'll just keep reiterating that point. And part of our role, or my team's role in Rwanda, Malawi, and Tanzania as advisors almost to smallholder farmers, is that we would not want to connect you maybe to an individual farmer who is, as some of us have said, the poorest of the poor who really are not able to take on that technology or that responsibility yet. We want to connect you with farming communities or farmers, individual farmers who have more land that are able to take on the responsibility of layering in a technology like irrigation. So we're trying to set the foundation for success for you to be able to plug into. And that means maybe the farming community being able to recognize what it takes in terms of spending the money on that technology, how long it will take for them to repay it, understand what their crop yields will need to be and what markets they need to sell into to be able to make that successful. And so I think opening up those conversations is really important, and I would encourage you to, if you're in any of the countries that my team is in, reach out to us to work with you in having those conversations so that we can kind of succeed together.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you for your time, for your insights again. I learned a lot from sitting and speaking with you today, and I look forward to the networking sessions because I have a list of questions we haven't gone through, and I'm sure the other members have as well. Thank you. Thank you.